Gwendolyn Ashford had counted the coins in the strongbox 3 times before she trusted the number enough to write it down. 6 shillings and a handful of pence. Not enough to mend the roof before winter, but enough, perhaps, to keep the High Crag Tavern fed through another fortnight. She closed the ledger and blew out the smaller of her 2 candles to save the wax. The tavern sat alone on the high shoulder of Frost Spire Pass, the only shelter for 11 miles in any direction, and most nights it stayed as quiet as the mountains around it. Gwendolyn liked it that way. She had built her whole life around quiet, ever since she'd come north 4 years ago, with nothing but a trunk of clothes and a determination never to be found. The sound reached her before she understood what it was. A low groan from the mountainside, deep and grinding, like the earth itself clearing its throat. Then a crack, sharp as a musket shot, and the whole building shuddered. She was at the door in an instant, wrenching it open against the wind. Down where the road bent around Crag Hollow, a wall of mud and broken pine had come loose from the slope above and swallowed the pass whole. In the darkness, she could just make out shapes moving, horses shying, men shouting to be heard over the storm, lanterns swinging wild. There was nowhere else for them to go. She knew that stretch of road as well as she knew her own kitchen, and she knew there was no way around the slide before morning. Whoever these travelers were, the mountain had decided their night for them. Gwendolyn lit 2 more lamps, set the kettle over the fire, and went out into the rain to bring them in. The man who rode at the head of the column dismounted before the others, moving with the unhurried authority of someone rarely required to hurry for anything. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired beneath a soaked greatcoat, with the kind of face that gave nothing away until he chose to let it. 15 mounted guards followed him, their uniforms marking them as no ordinary escort. These were soldiers, and well-equipped ones. "Marquess Cassian Delmar," he said, water running from the brim of his hat. "My apologies for the imposition. We had no warning of the slide." "No one ever does," Gwendolyn said. "Bring your men inside before the cold takes them. I've rooms enough, though you'll be sharing." She did not ask why a marquess traveled with 15 guards through a mountain pass in the dead of autumn, and he did not offer to explain. That suited her. She had spent 4 years asking no questions of strangers and answering none about herself, and she saw no reason to break the habit now. The next hours passed in the particular rhythm she knew well, feeding hungry men, drying wet cloaks by the fire, settling arguments over who would sleep where. She moved through it quietly, refilling cups, clearing plates, present in every corner of the tavern, and noticed in none of them. It was, she had long ago decided, the safest way to be seen. It was in the main hall, past midnight, that she first heard the trouble in their voices. Cassian had spread a map across the largest table, and his officers crowded round it, their faces drawn tight with worry. She caught fragments as she passed with a tray of ale. Oakhaven's forces, a river crossing, a valley she didn't recognize by name. One of the younger officers kept jabbing a finger at a cluster of markers near the eastern ridge, insisting on a position that made the others frown. "If we hold the ridge with the main body," the young officer was saying, "Oakhaven has no choice but to come at us from the valley floor. We'll have the high ground." Gwendolyn set the tray down and should have walked away. She had walked away from 100 conversations exactly like this one, in exactly this tone, over exactly this kind of map. But her eyes had already gone to the markers, and her mind, quicker than her better judgment, had already found the flaw. They were leaving the northern approach open. Anyone who knew that country would see it in a heartbeat. The ridge looked strong, but a force moving along the tree line could slip behind it entirely and cut the holding party off from its supply road. She had made that exact mistake once herself, a lifetime ago, and it had cost men their lives before she'd learned better. She should have said nothing. She told herself so even as her hand reached for the markers. Without a word, she stepped to the table, moved 3 wooden pieces to close the gap along the northern tree line, and stepped back before anyone could ask her what she thought she was doing. The room went silent. Every officer stared at the map, then at her, then back at the map, as though the markers might explain themselves. Gwendolyn said nothing at all. She picked up her tray and returned to the kitchen, her heart hammering harder than it had any right to, and told herself that whatever happened next, it was no longer any concern of hers. But she did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the wind claw at the shutters, and she knew, with the same cold certainty that had once ruled her whole life, that she had just made a mistake she would not be able to take back. Gwendolyn woke before dawn, out of habit rather than rest, her mind still turning over the map from the night before. She told herself the matter was finished. She had corrected an error, said nothing more, and by midday the guards would be gone, back to whatever war they were fighting in whatever valley they were fighting it in. Her life would return to its narrow, safe shape. She was proven wrong before she had even finished laying the fire. Cassian found her in the pantry, where she had gone to fetch flour for the morning bread. He filled the doorway without meaning to, and something in his stillness told her he had not come for breakfast. "I looked at the map again this morning," he said, "in daylight, with a clear head. The correction you made last night, it wasn't a guess. It was nothing, a servant's idle thought." She kept her eyes on the flour sack, measuring out more than she needed just to have something for her hands to do. A servant's idle thought does not close a flanking gap that 3 senior officers missed entirely. He stepped further into the small room, and she felt, not for the first time in her life, the particular danger of being looked at too closely. I have seen that exact maneuver before. 10 years ago, in the border campaigns, when we broke Calder's advance at Thistlewood Ridge. Every officer in the regiment studied it afterward. No one ever learned who devised it. They called her the ghost tactician because she left her mark on every battle she touched, and no one ever saw her face. Gwendolyn's hands went still on the flour sack. "I don't know what you're speaking of," she said, but her voice had lost its steadiness, and she heard it falter, even as she spoke. "I think you do." Cassian's tone was not unkind, but it was certain, the tone of a man who had already worked out the answer and was only waiting for her to stop denying it. "The northern gap you closed last night is the same principle, executed the same way, down to the very angle of the markers. I have spent 10 years wondering who that woman was. I did not expect to find her keeping a tavern in the mountains." For a long moment, Gwendolyn said nothing at all. The kitchen fire crackled somewhere behind her, and outside the wind had finally begun to quiet, as though the storm itself were waiting to hear what she would say. "My name was not always Gwendolyn Ashford," she said at last, so softly he had to lean in to catch it. "I was born Eleanor Winslow. My father was a colonel, and he taught me maps and terrain the way other fathers teach their daughters embroidery. I never meant for anyone to know my work was mine. It was easier that way, easier for the officers to accept a strategy with no woman's name attached to it, and safer for me besides." "What happened?" Cassian asked. "Why does the ghost tactician now pour ale in a mountain tavern?" Her jaw tightened. "Thistlewood Ridge happened. We won the battle, exactly as I planned it. But men still died there. Fewer than they would have otherwise, but men all the same, and I had drawn every line that sent them to that field. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. My father saw what the work was doing to me and begged me to walk away before it broke me entirely, so I did." I sold what I could, took a new name, and came north to a place where no one would ever ask me to move another marker across another map. She met his eyes for the first time since he'd entered the room. I have not touched a strategy table in 4 years, my lord. I do not intend to start again. Cassian was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name, not disbelief, and not pity either, but something closer to recognition, as though he understood exactly what it cost a person to walk away from the thing they were most gifted at. I need you, he said finally. Not as a servant, and not for one evening's favor. Lord Oakhaven is moving against the Eastern Territories, with a force 3 times the size of mine, and every officer I have is competent, but none of them is brilliant. I cannot promise you glory, and I cannot promise you it will be easy. But I can promise you that the men riding with me will live or die by decisions made in the coming days, and you are the finest strategic mind I have ever encountered. Then find another finest mind, Gwendolyn said, though the words cost her more than she wanted to admit. I built this tavern from nothing. I have a life here that asks nothing of me but honest work and quiet evenings. I will not trade that for a war that isn't mine. It may become yours whether you wish it or not, Cassian said gently. Oakhaven's scouts have likely already marked this pass as a route through the mountains. If they come looking for me, they will find you as well, Tactician or Tavern keeper. Gwendolyn opened her mouth to argue, to insist that no army had any cause to trouble an isolated inn at the edge of nowhere. But even as she formed the words, some old and careful part of her mind, the part she had spent 4 years trying to silence, was already listening to the wind outside and wondering how far behind them Oakhaven's scouts truly were. She said nothing more. She only turned back to her flour sack, her hands trembling slightly, and hoped, without much conviction, that the Marquess was wrong. The argument might have gone on through the whole of the morning had the horn not sounded. It came from beyond the tree line, thin and urgent, and every man in the tavern went still at the sound of it. Gwendolyn recognized the particular pitch of alarm in a soldier's face, even before the door burst open and a lookout stumbled in, breathless, his coat torn from pushing through the undergrowth. Riders, my lord, Oakhaven's colors, coming up from the eastern trail, 40 men, perhaps more, and closing fast. Cassian was already moving, shouting orders that sent his guards scrambling for weapons and windows. His second-in-command, a broad, hard-jawed officer named Captain Hollis, began barking for the men to form up at the front door. "We meet them head-on," Hollis said. 15 against 40 is poor odds, but we hold the doorway and we hold the advantage of the walls. Gwendolyn felt the old instinct rise in her before she could stop it, sharp and clear as a struck bell. She stepped forward without meaning to. "You'll lose half your men in the first minute," she said. "A doorway only protects you until they bring up anything heavier than muskets, and 40 riders will have at least one man carrying powder enough to blow the hinges. You cannot win a fight you have already chosen on their terms." Hollis turned on her, red-faced. "With respect, madam, this is a matter for soldiers." "With respect, Captain, this tavern is mine, and I know every stone of it better than you know your own barracks." She looked past him to Cassian, whose eyes had already found hers, waiting. "There is another way, but it means trusting me completely, and it means no man draws blood unless there is no possible alternative." Cassian did not hesitate. "Command them." Hollis opened his mouth to protest, but a single look from the Marquess silenced him. Gwendolyn felt the weight of 15 pairs of eyes settle on her, wary and uncertain, and understood in that moment that she had just stepped back into the exact life she had sworn to leave behind. There was no time now to mourn it. "The tavern has a cellar that runs beneath the stable yard," she said quickly, already moving toward the kitchen. "Built by the man who owned this place before me, for smuggling brandy past the excisemen, long before my time. It comes up inside the old stone stable at the edge of the yard. 6 of you, follow me now, quietly. The rest stay above and make noise, enough that they believe the whole garrison is still inside these walls." She led the 6 chosen guards down through the cellar's low stone passage, damp and close and smelling of earth, while above them she could hear the scouts' horses drawing nearer, hooves striking the frozen yard. At her signal, the men eased open the stable's rear door and slipped inside among the hay and harness, weapons ready, but lowered, waiting. Above, in the tavern itself, the remaining guards moved between windows with lanterns and shouted orders, creating the impression of a full company preparing to make a stand. Gwendolyn had told them exactly what to do, not to fight, only to appear as though fighting were imminent, to draw the scouts' attention toward the front of the building and away from the stable behind it. It worked exactly as she had known it would. Oak Haven's scouts, expecting resistance at the door, dismounted and advanced on foot toward the tavern's front steps, muskets raised, calling for the Marquess to surrender himself. They never once glanced toward the stable at their backs. Gwendolyn gave the second signal, a soft owl's call, the same one her father had taught her as a girl, back when such signals had meant something entirely different. The 6 guards moved from the stable in near silence, closing the great wooden doors behind the scouts' own horses and dropping the heavy crossbar into place. 2 more guards, working from the loft above, released a tangle of harness rope across the yard's narrow gate, tripping 3 scouts who tried to flee back the way they'd come. Within the hour, without a single shot fired, the entire scouting party found itself locked inside the stone stable, shouting and pounding at doors too solid to break, while Cassian's men stood guard outside with muskets they had never needed to fire. Cassian found Gwendolyn afterward in the yard, watching the frost settle on the stable roof, her hands still faintly trembling from the cold and from something else besides. "No one hurt," he said quietly, as much wonder in his voice as gratitude. 40 armed men, and not one of them harmed, nor one of mine. "That was the whole point," Gwendolyn said. "A battle you don't have to fight is always the one worth winning. You said you hadn't touched a strategy table in 4 years. I hadn't." She wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. "I had hoped never to again." Cassian studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression had changed since that morning. Less persuasion now, more plain respect. Oak Haven's main force will already know his scouts rode this direction. When they fail to report, more will come, and in far greater number than 40. This tavern will not be safe for you much longer, whether you choose to help me or not. Gwendolyn looked back at the stable, at the men trapped inside it who would soon be released unharmed and sent stumbling back through the woods to report a defeat that would surely enrage their commander. She thought of the tavern's roof, still unmended, and the quiet life she had built, stone by stone, over 4 careful years, now cracking open before her, like the mountainside in last night's storm. "Give me until morning," she said at last. "I have a great deal to pack, and very little time in which to say goodbye to the only peace I've known." She did not sleep that night either, but this time it was not fear that kept her awake. It was grief, quiet and unhurried, moving through the rooms of the tavern like a visitor she could not turn away. Gwendolyn walked through every part of the building by candlelight, touching things she had touched 1,000 times before, as though for the first time and the last one together. The worn groove in the bar where she rested her elbow while pouring ale, the scorch mark on the hearthstone from a fire she'd let get away from her in her first winter, when she still burned things and made mistakes, and no one in the world knew her name well enough to judge her for it. The small window in the upstairs room where she liked to sit on quiet evenings and watch the light change over the pass, the one true luxury she had allowed herself. 4 years of careful, ordinary life, built one plain day at a time. She had thought, when she first climbed this mountain with her trunk and her new name, that she was building a hiding place. She understood now that she had been building something closer to a self, a woman who was allowed to be tired, allowed to be unremarkable, allowed to close a door at night and know that nothing waited behind it, demanding a strategy from her. By morning, she had packed only what mattered, a small chest of clothes, her mother's shawl, the battered leather case that held her father's old drafting tools, compass and rule and ink, which she had told herself for 4 years she kept only out of sentiment and had never once opened. Cassian met her in the yard as the sun came up gray and reluctant over the ridgeline. He did not press her, did not ask if she had changed her mind, only helped load her small chest onto one of the pack horses with his own hands, which surprised her more than she wanted it to. Valenford Estate lies 2 days south, he said, if the weather holds and we keep to the woodland trails rather than the main carriage road. The estate belongs to my mother's family. It's well fortified, old walls, a strong garrison, and far enough from Oakhaven's current position to give us time to prepare properly. And the main road? Gwendolen asked, though she already suspected the answer. Watched, almost certainly. Oakhaven will have riders posted at every crossing wide enough for a carriage. The woodland trails are slower and harder on the horses, but far less likely to see us caught in the open. He glanced at her, something careful in the look. I imagined you would already have reasoned that out. I had, she admitted. I only wanted to hear whether you'd reasoned it out yourself or whether I'd be doing all the thinking for this company from here to the valley. For the first time since the storm had brought him to her door, Cassian laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though he hadn't expected to find room for it in the middle of everything else. Fair enough, Ghost Tactician. I'll try to earn my rank along the way. They set out at noon, 15 guards and their Marquess, and one tavern keeper who was no longer entirely certain what to call herself, moving in careful single file along a trail that wound through stands of pine and birch, already turning gold and brittle with the season. Gwendolen rode near the rear of the column, where she could watch the whole company, and where, out of old habit, she could see any danger approaching from behind before it reached the men ahead. The trail was harder than the main road would have been, climbing and dipping through country that offered no comfort and considerable danger to unfamiliar horses. Twice they had to dismount and lead the animals down slopes too steep and loose to ride. Gwendolen found herself, without quite meaning to, correcting the pace of the column, slowing the front riders when the trail narrowed, warning of soft ground before a horse could stumble into it, reading the shape of the land the way other people read a familiar book. It was mid-afternoon when young Corporal Ferris, riding just ahead of her, lost his footing on a loose slope of shale and went down hard, his ankle twisting beneath him with a sound that made several of the older men wince. He was young, barely past 20, and he bit down on his cry of pain so fiercely that Gwendolen saw blood at his lip. She was off her horse before Cassian had even turned in his saddle. "Don't move it," she said, kneeling beside him. "Let me see." Her hands, so recently trembling with grief and fear, went steady the moment there was a task in front of them. She had learned field wounds from her father, alongside maps and terrain, in the same careful, thorough way, and the knowledge had never once left her. She bound the ankle tightly, with strips torn from her own petticoat, fashioned a crude support from a broken branch, and had the boy back on his horse within the quarter hour, pale but steady. Cassian watched the whole of it without a word, and when she finally looked up and caught his eye, she saw in his face something she recognized uneasily. Not the desperate persuasion of a man who needed her gift, but plain wonder at the whole of who she was, gift and grief, and steady hands together. "You keep surprising me," he said quietly, as the column began to move again. "I've had 4 years to build myself into someone new," Gwendolyn said, urging her horse forward beside his. "It seems the old one never entirely left." They rode on into the lengthening afternoon, the trail bending south toward Valenford, and behind them, somewhere beyond the ridgeline, Gwendolyn knew that Lord Oakhaven's main army was already beginning to move. By the second morning, the trail had worn everyone thin. They had slept in a shepherd's abandoned hut the night before, 16 bodies crowded into a space meant for 4, and Gwendolyn had woken before the others with a stiff back and a mind already turning toward the day's difficulties. Chief among them was Blackwood Creek. She knew the crossing from old maps her father had kept, long before she'd ever imagined needing such knowledge again. A narrow stone bridge, the only crossing for miles in either direction, spanning a creek too swift and cold to ford safely on horseback, this late in the year. When the column crested the last rise before the water, her fears were confirmed at once. Oakhaven's patrol held the bridge. She counted perhaps a dozen men, armed and alert, positioned at both ends of the stonework, with the easy confidence of soldiers who believed themselves the only obstacle standing between their commander and his enemy. Captain Hollis, predictably, reached for his sword before he'd even fully reined in his horse. 12 men against 15. We can take the bridge by force before they've time to send word ahead. You could, Gwendolyn said, still studying the water rather than the guards, and half of you would likely die doing it, and the other half would arrive at Valenford, too battered to be of any use in the fight that actually matters. There's a better way. Give me a moment. She walked her horse along the tree line, keeping well back from the open ground where the guards might spot her, and let her eyes trace the whole shape of the valley, the creek's swift, narrow channel, the old stone bridge with its low parapets, and further upstream, half hidden by willow and neglect, the crumbling shape of a watermill that had clearly not turned its wheel in years. There, she said, half to herself, and Cassian, who had followed her without a word, leaned forward to see where she pointed. An old mill, what use is that to us? Every use in the world, if the lock gate still holds. Gwendolyn's mind was already moving through the mechanics of it, the same swift, certain calculation she remembered from years she'd sworn never to revisit. A working mill controls its own flow, with a gate upstream, releasing water when needed and holding it back the rest of the time. If that gate has been shut for years while the mill pond filled behind it, releasing it now would send a sudden surge downstream, loud, sudden, and utterly harmless to anyone standing well clear of the bank. Cassian's eyes narrowed with understanding. A noise loud enough to draw the guards from their posts. Guards posted at a quiet bridge for days on end grow bored, and bored men investigate loud, unexplained noises, especially ones that sound like they might signal a company on the move. She turned to him fully now, something almost bright in her exhaustion. If we time it correctly, the surge draws their attention upstream, just long enough for us to cross the bridge behind their backs, on foot, leading the horses quietly across the stonework, while they're occupied gawking at rushing water. Hollis, still unconvinced, folded his arms. And if the gate doesn't hold, if it collapses entirely, or floods the very ground we mean to cross, then we'll know within the first 30 seconds of trying, and we'll have lost nothing but a little time, Gwendolen said evenly. I'd rather risk 30 seconds than risk your men's lives on an open bridge against a dozen muskets. That is, unless the captain has a plan of his own he'd like the rest of us to hear. Hollis said nothing, and Cassian, watching the exchange, allowed himself the smallest trace of a smile before turning back to business. They moved into position with care, 2 guards sent ahead through the trees to reach the old mill, unseen, while the rest of the column waited in the cover of the woods, horses' muzzles held quiet, breath fogging in the cold morning air. Gwendolen crouched beside Cassian at the tree line, watching the bridge guards pace their slow, bored circuits, and felt the old familiar tightness settle into her chest. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular alertness of a mind holding many moving pieces at once, and waiting to see if they would fall into place. The signal came at last, a distant creak of old timber, then a low rumble building swiftly into a roar as the mill's lock gate gave way and released years of trapped water in a sudden violent surge down the creek bed. The sound was extraordinary, a great rushing crash that sent birds scattering from every tree along the bank. Every guard on the bridge turned at once, several of them abandoning their posts entirely to hurry upstream and see what disaster had befallen the old mill. Now Gwendolen breathed, and Cassian gave the signal. 16 figures moved from the tree line in near total silence, leading their horses on foot across the stonework, boots muffled against the noise, still echoing off the valley walls. Gwendolen crossed near the front of the group this time, her heart hammering, counting seconds the way she used to count them years ago on far bloodier ground, and did not breathe easily again until the last horse's hooves struck solid earth on the far bank. They were well into the trees beyond the bridge, the guards still shouting confused questions to one another over the retreating rush of water, before anyone thought to look behind them and notice the crossing stood empty. Cassian pulled his horse alongside hers as the column pushed onward, his expression somewhere between relief and something warmer that he did not quite name. "Twice now," he said, "you've won us a fight without a single blow struck. I begin to wonder what you might accomplish with an actual army behind you, instead of 15 tired men and a chest of borrowed courage." "I wonder the same thing," Gwendolen admitted, "and it frightens me rather more than Oakhaven does." They pushed hard through the afternoon, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the bridge before the guards there thought to send word of their vanished quarry. Gwendolen rode near the front of the column now, a change no one remarked upon aloud, though she noticed how the men's eyes found her more easily than they had 2 days before, not with suspicion any longer, but with the particular respect soldiers reserve for someone who has kept them alive. It was Corporal Ferris, still favoring his bandaged ankle, who broke the quiet first. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, drawing his horse alongside hers, "but the men have been wondering. Is it true what the captain says, that you're the one they called the Ghost Tactician, back at Thistlewood?" Gwendolen glanced ahead to where Hollis rode, jaw set, clearly displeased that his private grumbling had reached the ranks. "It's true," she said simply, "though I'd ask you not to make too much of it. I'm no different a person for the name." "My uncle fought at Thistlewood," Ferris said, undeterred, said the strategy that broke Calder's line was the finest piece of soldiering he'd ever seen, and no one ever could say who'd devised it. He always reckoned it must have been some old general, retired and unwilling to take the credit. He shook his head, something like wonder in his young face. Never once did he guess it might have been a woman with a tavern in the mountains. "Most people wouldn't," Gwendolyn said, and let the matter rest there, though she found herself, for the first time in years, not entirely displeased to have been recognized. The trail began to widen as the afternoon wore on, the dense woodland giving way gradually to open pasture and low stone walls that marked the beginnings of settled country. Cassian rode up beside her as the column crested a final rise, and below them, perhaps 3 miles distant, she caught her first sight of Valenford, a broad gray manor house crowning a low hill, its walls thick and old, surrounded by cultivated fields that had clearly not gone untended, even with war creeping toward them. "Nearly there," Cassian said, and something in his voice carried more relief than she'd expected from a man who had faced down 40 armed scouts without flinching. "You're worried," she observed. It was not a question. He was quiet a moment before answering. "The council at Valenford has never met you. They know only that I'm arriving with a tavern keeper from the mountains and asking them to trust her judgment over that of officers they've served alongside for years. Men are not always generous toward ideas that arrive wearing an unfamiliar face. I'm accustomed to being underestimated," Gwendolyn said. "It has its uses. A person no one expects much from is rarely watched closely enough to be stopped." Cassian studied her, and there was something in his expression that had shifted steadily over the past 2 days, something she recognized with a small, unwelcome jolt of feeling, not merely respect now, but a warmth that unsettled her more than Oakhaven's entire army had managed to. "You keep speaking as though you expect to be doubted and dismissed everywhere you go," he said. "I confess, I no longer see why anyone would dismiss you at all." Gwendolyn looked away, busying herself unnecessarily with her horse's reins. 4 years ago, I would have told you the same thing about myself, before Thistlewood taught me otherwise. Being believed in has a cost, my lord. Every time someone trusts your judgment with men's lives, and you're right, they trust you a little more, and ask a little more, until one day you look up and realize the weight of an entire war rests on your shoulders, and you never once agreed to carry it. And if I promise you," Cassian said carefully, "that whatever happens at Valenford, I will not let that weight fall on you alone?" She wanted to believe him. That frightened her nearly as much as the promise itself. Before she could answer, a shout went up from the rear guard. One of the men posted to watch their back trail had spotted movement, distant but unmistakable, along the ridge they had crossed hours before. Riders, moving fast, far more of them than any patrol. "Oakhaven's main column," Cassian said grimly, all warmth gone from his voice in an instant, replaced by the flat calculation of a man already counting distances and hours. "They've found the bridge and guessed our direction." Gwendolyn's mind was already working, measuring the distance to Valenford's walls against the speed of pursuing cavalry, the terrain between them and safety, the narrow window in which a decision made now would determine whether 15 men reached shelter or were run down in open country. 3 miles, she said. "If we hold formation and don't tire the horses with panic, we'll reach the gates well ahead of them. But send a rider now, fast as he can manage, to warn the garrison we're coming, and that trouble follows close behind." Cassian gave the order, without hesitation, and one of the younger guards spurred ahead, vanishing down the slope toward the distant walls. The rest of the column pressed forward at a hard, steady pace, Valenford's gray towers growing slowly larger against the darkening sky, while behind them, faint but growing louder with every passing minute, came the sound of an army that had finally caught their scent. They reached the gates of Valenford just as the last light was failing. the great iron-bound doors swinging open ahead of them at the warning rider's word, and closing again the moment the final horse cleared the threshold with a heavy, final sound that Gwendolen felt in her chest more than heard. Behind them, distant torches marked where Oakhaven's column had halted at the base of the hill, too far off to press an attack in darkness against fortified walls, but close enough that no one within the estate mistook the danger for anything less than real. The courtyard erupted into ordered chaos, grooms running for the horses, guards taking up positions along the wall, and at the center of it all, a cluster of older men in the dark coats of the regional council, waiting with expressions that ranged from relief to open suspicion the moment their eyes settled on Gwendolen. "My Lord Delmar." A tall, silver-haired man stepped forward, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone long accustomed to being obeyed. "We had word you were bringing reinforcements. We did not expect them to arrive in the form of a tavern keeper." "Lord Pemberton," Cassian said, swinging down from his horse with the stiffness of a man who had ridden hard for 2 days straight. "This is Gwendolen Ashford. Without her, none of us would have reached your gates at all. She is the strategist responsible for the maneuver at Thistlewood Ridge 10 years ago." A murmur ran through the assembled officers, some skeptical, some openly startled. Pemberton's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only outward sign of his surprise. "The ghost tactician," he said slowly, as though testing the words for truth. "I served under General Ashworth at Thistlewood myself. We spent a decade wondering who to thank for that victory." He studied Gwendolen with new attention, though his tone remained carefully measured. "Forgive me if I withhold judgment until I've seen the evidence for myself, madam. We are facing an army 3 times our number, and I've little patience left for stories, however remarkable." "Then let me show you the ground instead of telling you the tale," Gwendolen said, and something in her steady, unhurried tone seemed to settle the courtyard more than any credential could have. They convened within the hour, in Valenford's great hall, a room built for exactly this purpose, with a vast oak table already scattered with maps of the valley and its surrounding hills. Gwendolen approached it the way she might once have approached her father's study as a girl, with a kind of hushed, focused hunger that she'd spent 4 years trying to forget she possessed. She studied the terrain in silence for several long minutes while officers shifted uncomfortably around her, waiting. Then she began to speak, and once she started, she found she could not have stopped, even had she wanted to. She traced the valley's natural choke points, the places where Oakhaven's superior numbers would be forced to compress into narrow ground and lose their advantage. She marked the estate's weakest walls, where the stonework had been patched rather than properly rebuilt, and proposed reinforcing them with earthworks that could be raised within a single night. She identified the high pasture to the north, where cavalry might attempt a flanking approach, and suggested positioning archers among the tree line there, hidden and ready. By the time she finished, the great hall had gone entirely silent. Every officer bent over the map she had redrawn with swift, sure strokes, tracing lines that revealed a defense far more sophisticated than anything the council had devised in weeks of preparation. Pemberton was the last to speak, and when he did, his earlier skepticism had entirely drained from his voice. "I have commanded men for 30 years, he said quietly. "I have never seen a defense plan assembled with such speed, nor with such economy of force. If even half of what you propose can be built before Oakhaven advances, we may hold this estate without losing it, and perhaps without losing many men at all." He looked at Cassian, then back at Gwendolen. "You have my support, madam. Whatever hesitation I carried when you rode through those gates." One by one, the other officers murmured their agreement, and Gwendolen felt the strange, unfamiliar weight of a room full of soldiers looking to her for direction, not with doubt now, but with something closer to hope. Later, when the council had dispersed to begin the night's fortifications and the great hall had emptied of everyone but the two of them, Cassian found her still standing over the map, tracing the lines of her own plan with something like disbelief at what she'd built in a single evening. "You did that," he said, without a moment's hesitation. 4 years of insisting you'd left this life behind, and it took you less than an hour to command an entire war council. "It frightens me more than it should," Gwendolen admitted. "I told myself I'd buried this part of who I am. Tonight, I learned it was never buried at all." "Only waiting." Cassian's expression softened, and for a moment, the exhaustion of the past 2 days seemed to fall away from his face entirely. "Perhaps it needn't be a thing you bury at all. Perhaps it's simply a thing you are, the same as your kindness, or your steady hands with a wounded soldier's ankle." Gwendolen looked up at him, startled by the gentleness in his voice, and found she had no ready answer for it, only the uncomfortable, unfamiliar sense that somewhere along the road from High Crag to Valenford, she had begun to lose the careful distance she'd always kept between herself and the people whose lives depended on her judgment. Outside, beyond the newly reinforced walls, the torches of Oakhaven's army still burned in the darkness, waiting for morning. The estate did not sleep that night. Torches burned along the walls, and the sound of shovels and hammers rang out across the courtyard as men worked through the darkness, raising earthworks exactly where Gwendolen had marked them, reinforcing gates, and moving stores of grain and water into the inner keep in case the outer walls did not hold. Gwendolen moved among it all, with a lantern in one hand and her father's old drafting case in the other, finally opened after 4 years of gathering dust in the bottom of her trunk. She had thought, when she first packed it for the journey south, that she was only carrying sentiment. She understood now that some part of her had known, even then, that she would need it before this was over. She spent the better part of the night in the estate's supply house, working alongside the quartermaster to reorganize what stores they had into positions that would serve the coming defense rather than simple convenience. Grain moved closer to the inner keep, water barrels positioned near the north wall, where fire was most likely if Oakhaven's men attempted to burn their way through the reinforced gate. Bandages and medicine set aside in a room close enough to the fighting to be useful, far enough to remain safe. It was exacting, exhausting work, and she welcomed every hour of it, because it left no room in her mind for anything but the task in front of her. She found Cassian near midnight on the courtyard wall, standing alone above the gate, looking out at the distant ring of enemy torches burning steadily against the dark hillside. He did not turn when she joined him, though she saw his shoulders ease slightly at the sound of her footsteps, as though he had been listening for them without quite admitting it to himself. "The supply lines are as sound as I can make them by morning," she said. "If the walls hold even a single day, we won't lack for food, water, or medicine. And if the walls don't hold, then supply lines will be the least of our troubles." She said it plainly, without softening it, because she had learned long ago that false comfort served no one facing a battle. "But they'll hold, my lord. Oakhaven has 3 times our men, but he doesn't have 3 times our ground, and ground matters more than numbers in country like this." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the careful formality he usually kept for matters of war. "I've watched you tonight, moving through this estate as though you'd commanded 100 campaigns instead of 1, 10 years past. Lord Pemberton has already asked me whether I might persuade you to accept a permanent position within the regional command, once this business with Oakhaven is finished. Gwendolyn's hands stilled on the lantern she carried. And what did you tell him? That I did not know your answer, though I confessed I hoped it might be yes. He turned to face her fully now, and in the torchlight, his expression held none of the Marquess's usual composure, only something rawer, more uncertain. You could have anything you wished, Gwendolyn. A position of real influence. Recognition for work you've spent a decade hiding. A life where your gift is honored instead of buried. She looked out at the enemy fires burning along the hillside, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, because the honest answer sat uneasily in her chest, tangled up with feelings she had not expected and did not entirely trust. "Do you remember what I told you in the pantry, that first morning?" she said finally. "That Thistlewood broke something in me. It wasn't the strategy itself. It was watching men I'd never met march into positions I'd drawn on a map, and knowing that every one of them who fell had trusted a stranger's judgment with the only life they had. I don't think that feeling ever truly leaves a person, once it's taken root. I carried it every day at the tavern, even in the quiet. I still carry it now." "Then why do this at all?" Cassian asked, gently. "Why not have refused me outright, that first morning, and let another strategist take up the burden?" "Because I looked at 15 men trapped in a tavern with an army bearing down on them, and I found I couldn't stand by and let them die simply to protect my own peace of mind." She finally met his eyes. "That's the truth of it, my lord. I never stopped caring what happened to people. I only stopped believing I could carry that caring and survive it whole. My only wish, once this is over, whatever becomes of it, is to return to my quiet life, a roof I can mend with my own hands. Evenings that ask nothing more of me than themselves." Cassian studied her for a long moment, something unspoken moving behind his eyes, and when he finally answered, his voice had gone soft in a way she had not heard from him before. "Then I will not ask you to give that up," he said. "Whatever tomorrow brings, I promise you this much. I will see you return to your tavern when it's over. Roof mended, peace restored, whatever it costs to arrange it." She wanted to believe he could keep such a promise. Wars, she had learned long ago, rarely honored the promises made the night before them. Below, in the courtyard, the last of the earthworks was finally finished, and the estate settled into a tense, watchful quiet, waiting for the dawn that would decide everything. Dawn came gray and still, with a mist clinging low to the valley floor that Gwendolyn had watched for from her window through the last dark hour before light, calculating exactly what use might be made of it. Oakhaven's forces arrayed themselves along the north ridge shortly after sunrise, their numbers laid bare across the high ground in a display clearly meant to break the defenders' resolve before a single blow was struck. Gwendolyn stood on the estate's outer wall beside Cassian and Lord Pemberton, counting ranks with a steady, practiced eye, and did not like the sum she reached. 3-1, Pemberton said grimly. "Perhaps worse. He means to overwhelm us by sheer weight of numbers rather than skill. And given those odds, he's not wrong to try it." "He would be right," Gwendolyn said, "if this were a battle decided by numbers alone. It rarely is." She had spent the small hours before dawn walking the northern tree line with two of the estate's own foresters, men who knew every fold of that ground from a lifetime spent working it. And by the time the mist began to lift, she had already built the shape of a plan in her mind, one that relied on nothing so costly as blades or muskets. "Empty supply wagons," she said now, turning to Cassian. "How many can we spare without weakening our own stores?" "A dozen, perhaps." "Why?" Because Oakhaven cannot see through trees any better than we can, and a dozen wagons, positioned along the tree line, half hidden and glimpsed only in fragments, will look to distant eyes like the leading edge of a far larger force massing to strike his flank. She was already moving as she spoke, sketching the shape of the deception in the frost-dusted dirt of the wall walk with a stick, the same restless, hungry focus that had taken hold of her in Valenford's great hall 2 nights before. Add mounted mirrors among the branches, catching the morning light at intervals, as though sunlight glinted off massed steel and armor. Lantern signals after dusk, spaced to suggest a camp far larger than any dozen wagons could actually house. Oakhaven's scouts will report exactly what they believe they're seeing, and belief is worth more than truth on a battlefield, so long as the enemy never gets close enough to test it. Pemberton stared at her, something between alarm and admiration crossing his weathered face. You mean to win this entire engagement with wagons and looking glasses? I mean to win it without losing a single man of ours, or theirs, if it can possibly be helped, Gwendolen said. Lord Oakhaven did not build his reputation through recklessness. He's a cautious commander, which is precisely why this will work. A cautious man who believes himself outnumbered will not gamble everything on a single reckless charge. He'll hesitate and reconsider and send scouts to confirm what he thinks he's seeing, and every hour he hesitates is an hour that favors us. Cassian gave the order, within the half hour, and Gwendolen oversaw the placement herself, moving along the tree line with the foresters as the wagons were dragged into position, angled carefully to catch fragments of morning light through gaps in the branches. Mirrors, borrowed from every dressing table and hallway in the manor house, were mounted high in the trees at irregular intervals, tilted to flash sudden bright glints toward the ridge whenever the mist thinned enough to let the sun through. By mid-morning, the deception stood complete, and Gwendolen climbed back to the wall walk beside Cassian to watch its effect upon the enemy line. It came slowly at first, a stirring among Oakhaven's ranks, riders sent forward to study the tree line more closely, then falling back again, uncertain. A cluster of officers gathered near the center of the ridge, clearly arguing, their voices too distant to carry, but their gestures unmistakable in their agitation. They've seen it, Cassian murmured, watching intently, or seen enough of it to doubt themselves. Give it another hour, Gwendolen said, though her own hands had curled tight around the stone parapet, the old familiar tension of waiting to learn whether a plan built in darkness would survive contact with daylight and an enemy's judgment. Uncertainty is a slower poison than fear, but it works just as surely, given time. The hour passed with agonizing slowness, the mist finally burning away entirely to reveal the full breadth of Oakhaven's army, still arrayed along the ridge, unmoving, clearly locked in some fierce internal debate that none within Valenford's walls could hear. Then, midday, a single rider broke from the enemy line and began picking his way carefully down the slope toward the estate, a white cloth raised on a length of broken spear above his head. A parley, Pemberton breathed, disbelief plain in his voice. He means to ask for terms. Gwendolen allowed herself, for the first time in 2 days, a long, slow breath of something close to relief, though she did not let herself believe the danger fully past. Cautious men who requested terms could still change their minds, and the day was far from finished. "Send our own rider to meet him," she said to Cassian. "But let it be you who carries our answer, my lord. Whatever Oakhaven decides today, he should hear it from the man he came to defeat, not merely from the woman who outthought him." Cassian looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded in his face, despite the gravity of the hour. and then nodded and called for his horse. Cassian rode out alone beneath a flag of truce, down the long slope between the two waiting armies, while Gwendolen watched from the wall, with her heart beating harder than she cared to admit. She had built the illusion that brought Oakhaven's rider forward, but she could not control what passed between the two commanders once words replaced maps and markers, and that uncertainty sat heavier in her chest than any battle plan ever had. The two men met at the midpoint of the valley floor, too distant for anyone at the walls to hear their exchange, though Gwendolen found she could read a great deal in the shape of the conversation, even from so far away. Oakhaven sat his horse, stiffly at first, his posture defensive, a man unwilling to concede ground he had not yet lost. Cassian, by contrast, remained easy and unhurried, precisely as she had counseled him to be that morning, a commander who felt no need to press an advantage he already believed secure. "He's letting the silence work for him," Pemberton murmured beside her, watching the same distant scene with the practiced eye of an old soldier. "Oakhaven doesn't know what he's truly facing, and every moment your Marquess declines to fill that silence with reassurance only deepens his doubt." It was, Gwendolen reflected, precisely the strategy she had hoped for, though watching it unfold in real time, with real lives balanced on its outcome, proved a far harder thing than sketching it in dirt with a stick before dawn. The conversation stretched on for the better part of 20 minutes, Oakhaven's posture shifting gradually, from stiff suspicion to something more uncertain, his gestures growing sharper, more agitated, as though each passing minute chipped away at whatever confidence had carried him this far. Twice he turned his horse partway back toward his own ranks, as though considering breaking off the parley entirely, and twice something Cassian said brought him wheeling back around. At last, Oakhaven went still. Even from the distance of the wall, Gwendolen could see the change in him, the particular stillness of a man who has finally accepted a truth he spent the whole morning refusing to believe. Cassian returned alone, walking his horse at an unhurried pace that told the watching walls nothing of what had passed, and it was not until he had dismounted in the courtyard, Gwendolen and Pemberton hurrying down to meet him, that he finally allowed the tension to leave his shoulders. "He's asked for terms," Cassian said. "Full terms. Withdrawal of his entire force from the Eastern Territories, an end to his claim on the valley, and his word, given before witnesses, that he'll trouble this region no further." A ragged cheer went up from the nearest guards, quickly spreading across the courtyard as word carried from mouth to mouth, but Gwendolen found herself watching Cassian's face rather than celebrating, sensing there was more to the story than a simple victory. "What did you tell him?" she asked quietly. "That finally settled it?" Cassian's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I told him the truth, more or less, that the force massed along our tree line represented reinforcements drawn from 3 neighboring estates, gathered the moment word of his advance reached them, and that his scouts' failure to properly reconnoiter that position before committing his main army was, in my judgment, a costly oversight he would do well to correct before wagering his men's lives on it further." He glanced at Gwendolen, something like quiet wonder still lingering in his expression. "I did not lie to him, precisely. I simply allowed him to draw his own conclusions from what your wagons and mirrors had already shown him. A cautious man, faced with the possibility of a devastating defeat against an unknown force, chooses the safer path every time. You told me as much yourself, that first morning in the pantry, and he believed you. He believed his own eyes, and his own fear, which is a far more persuasive thing than anything I might have said to convince him outright." Cassian shook his head slowly, as though still working through the strangeness of the whole encounter. "He's ordered his men to lay down their arms even now. There will be no battle, no charge across that ridge, no defense of these walls under fire. Whatever losses either side might have suffered today, we've avoided every one of them." Gwendolen felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she'd been carrying since the moment the horn first sounded at High Crag, 3 days and a lifetime ago. She had spent 4 years believing herself broken by Thistlewood Ridge, incapable of touching this work again without repeating the same cost in lives that had driven her from it in the first place. Instead, she had built, piece by careful piece, an entire campaign that ended without a single drop of blood spilled on either side. "No one died," she said, half to herself, testing the words as though she did not quite trust them. "Not one man, on either side of that ridge. Because of you," Cassian said simply. "Every step of it, from the tavern to this courtyard, was built on judgment I could never have matched alone. Lord Oakhaven's men will ride home today to their own families, rather than to graves dug in a valley that was never truly theirs to claim. That is your doing, Gwendolen, whatever name you choose to answer to." She looked past him, out toward the ridge, where Oakhaven's soldiers were already beginning the long, orderly process of withdrawal, their banners lowering one by one against the pale afternoon sky, and allowed herself, finally, to believe that the worst of it was truly over. She did not yet know that the greater surprise of this whole affair still waited for her, 3 days distant, in a ceremony she could not have imagined even in her most restless dreams. 3 days after Oakhaven's withdrawal, Valenford's great hall had been transformed almost beyond recognition. Where maps and markers had once covered the long oak table, now stood banners and candles, and the hall itself rang with a warmth Gwendolen had not thought it capable of holding when she'd first stood over that table, calculating the odds of survival for 15 frightened men. She had spent the days since the surrender in a strange, suspended state, uncertain what her place was meant to be now that the danger had passed. She had helped tend the last of the minor injuries among the guards, had written out careful notes on the defenses they'd built in case another threat ever tested Valenford's walls again, and had found herself, more than once, simply standing on the wall walk in quiet moments, watching the valley settle back into ordinary peace, and wondering when Cassian would finally speak of the promise he'd made her that night before the standoff. He had said little of it since, occupied as he was with the business of a war's ending. Messengers to send, reports to write, Lord Pemberton and the council to reassure that the eastern territories now stood secure. Gwendolen had told herself she did not mind the waiting. She had told herself a great many things these past 3 days that she did not entirely believe. The ceremony, when it came, arrived with more grandeur than she had expected or wanted. The great hall filled with officers and councilmen, with the guards who had ridden with her from High Crag standing proudly near the front. Corporal Ferris among them, his ankle healed enough now that he stood without favoring it. Even Captain Hollis, who had doubted her from the first mile of their journey, stood at rigid attention, with an expression that had settled somewhere into grudging, genuine respect. Cassian stood at the head of the hall in formal dress, a rolled parchment sealed with wax held in both hands, and when Gwendolen was called forward, she felt every eye in the room settle on her at once, a weight she had spent 4 years carefully avoiding and now found, to her own surprise, she could bear. 3 days ago, Cassian began, his voice carrying easily across the hall, this territory faced an army 3 times our number, commanded by a man who had never once lost a campaign through carelessness. We stand here today, every one of us, because of decisions made not on any battlefield, but in a mountain tavern, by a woman who had sworn never to make such decisions again. He looked at her, and something in his gaze made the formal words falter briefly into something more personal, before he caught himself and continued. Gwendolen Ashford asked for nothing in return for what she gave us. She asked only, in the end, to be allowed to return to the quiet life she had built for herself at High Crag. He unrolled the parchment, and Gwendolen saw the royal seal pressed into its base, heavy and unmistakable, the kind of authority that reached far beyond even a Marquess's own considerable power. It is my honor, and the will of the Regional Council besides, to grant that wish, and a great deal more. He began to read. By royal charter, the High Crag Tavern and all lands attached to it are hereafter declared a sovereign, neutral sanctuary, exempt from claim by any lord or territory, and set aside permanently as a place of diplomatic refuge for any party seeking honest parley in times of conflict. Its keeper, Gwendolen Ashford, is granted full economic independence in perpetuity, freedom from taxation or tribute, and the permanent military protection of the Crown against any force that might threaten her sanctuary's neutrality. A murmur of astonishment ran through the hall. Gwendolen stood very still, the words settling over her slowly, each one landing with a weight she had not prepared herself to carry. You will never again, Cassian said, quieter now, though the hall had gone silent enough that every word still carried, be forced to fight a war that isn't yours, nor to abandon a peaceful life to save one that is. High Crag will stand, from this day forward, as proof that the wisest victories are the ones that cost nothing but cleverness and courage. Yours. He held the parchment out to her, and Gwendolen crossed the last few steps between them with hands that trembled, though not from fear this time. She took the charter carefully, feeling the weight of the seal against her palm, and looked up to find Cassian watching her, with an expression that held far more than simple ceremony. I did not do this for reward, she said softly, meant for him alone, though the hall had begun its applause around them. I know, he said. That is precisely why you deserved one. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, and Gwendolen found herself, for the first time in 4 years, surrounded by people who knew exactly who she was, and welcomed her for it, rather than despite it. Ferris toasted her with more enthusiasm than his still healing ankle strictly allowed. Even Hollis approached her near the fire, offering a stiff but sincere apology for his early doubts, which she accepted with more grace than he likely expected. It was Cassian who found her last, near midnight, standing once more at a window, watching the moon rise over unfamiliar hills, the charter still held carefully in her hands. You'll return to High Crag, he said. It was not quite a question. I will, though I suspect it will look rather different, once word spreads of what it's become. She glanced at him, something lighter in her chest than she had felt in years. You're welcome to visit, my lord, should your duties ever bring you north again. The tavern serves the finest ale in the mountains, and I'm told its keeper has a talent for solving difficult problems. Cassian smiled, the last of the Marquess's formal reserve finally falling away entirely. I rather think I'll find reason to visit quite often. Outside, the mountains waited, and for the first time since the storm that had first brought a stranger to her door, Gwendolen Ashford found she was not afraid of what came next.